Hi, it's Verity here from the creative team and welcome back to the channel. For today's video, I'm going back to basics. So this is a great video if you're a beginner in heat embossing or you've been doing heat embossing for a while but you just want a bit of a refresher just to pick up a few tips and really hone your embossing skills. Basically for heat embossing, there are three main tools that you need. You need an embossing pad, so Wow's clear ultra slow drying embossing pad is really great for staying sticky, giving you plenty of time before you add your powder. You need embossing powder, and Wow has a whole range of colours to suit anybody's taste. You name it, they've got it. And lastly, you need a heat gun. So Wow's heat gun is really great because it's a dual speed heat gun, so you can use it for multi-purposes within your crafting endeavours. Okay, so let's just talk about the Wow embossing powders. Now, Wow does a lot to the powders and treats it in quite a way that they do so much to remove the static from the powders. So you don't really want to put that static back into the powder when they've done all that work. A lot of people tend to like to store embossing powders in plastic containers, but you shouldn't do this with Wow embossing powders. It's a real no-no because you're just putting the static back into the powder. You also don't want to use any plastic spoons with them. If you're going to use a spoon, use a metal spoon. So instead, when you're using the Wow embossing powders, I suggest you use paper cake liners or coffee liners like this to catch the powder, or even a scrap of plain white paper. A big tip with heat embossing is that although Wow does everything to reduce its static, you can still get your inky fingers or sticky fingers on your cardstock. So my fingers weren't playing ball when I was filming this video. I had very unsticky fingers. So I had to stick my finger in the Wow embossing powder to then transfer some ink onto the cardstock. But then as you see, when I pour the powder over, the powder sticks to your sticky fingerprints that you've left on the card. Okay, so one way to get around this is to then use what's called an embossing buddy bag or tool. So this contains powder that's like cornstarch, and you use this to rub over your cardstock before you stamp down on it. So once you've placed your cardstock in your stamping platform, or you've just using it on a glass mat, before you go to stamp your design on, you just need to rub it with the powder, and that prevents any of your sticky fingerprints from actually adhering to it, allowing the powder to adhere to any of those sticky fingerprints. Once you cover it with powder, it doesn't cling, and it's brilliant. That you know you can stamp and emboss and you'll get crisp images. Now this powder does leave a bit of a residue, so I find once I've heat embossed, I go over with my eraser just to erase over the black cardstock, say if it's black, just to brighten it up because the powder can dull it a bit and you want that lovely black coloured cardstock. Okay, so to actually heat emboss, to show you, I'm going to use a solid stamp as well as a fine sentiment stamp for the embossing to show you some of my tips and tricks as I'm embossing. So as I mentioned, Wow embossing pad is ultra slow drying, so that's perfect for if you're not quick at getting from the stamped image to covering it with powder. You've got a bit of time to work with if you want to stamp several things and then heat emboss all in one go. That's a great way of reducing the warping to your card. So Wow's embossing pad is a foam pad and it holds a lot of ink in it. But Wow embossing also have an ink pad refill and conditioning tool. And it's so easy to use. You just unscrew the lid and then it's got a ball action in it to allow the ink, as you rub it over the ink pad, to recondition it and add some more ink to it so it's sticky. So don't worry if it starts to dry out, you can easily just refill your ink pad. So I'm stamping a heart and a Stay Cozy sentiment onto black cardstock. So for the Stay Cozy sentiment, I'm using the super fine embossing powder because this is great at keeping the very fine detail. If you use a regular embossing powder, you'd still see the sentiment. It's not going to completely obscure such a large sentiment as this, but a very small fine sentiment it might do. But you probably won't get as lovely crisp lines to it. For the actual solid heart, I'm covering that with some Wow bright opaque white regular because you want it to fill up the solid image quite well. Larger chunks allow it to melt and cover the surface area better. Now you can restamp it several times if you've got a stamping platform to get a very nice smooth stamped image, Or if you've got an embossing pen, if there's any areas where there's not such a smooth embossing, you can just go over that with the embossing pen, add some more powder, and then heat set it again. If you get any stray powder, like I have here with the heart, you can easily just use a very small paintbrush just to wipe away the powder that has strayed before you heat set it. So as I said, these cake liners, coffee liners or papers are great for funneling the powder back into your pot without creating too much mess or fuss. So as I mentioned, another great tool for heat embossing is your embossing gun, your heat gun, and WOW has a dual speed heat gun. It's got a slow setting and a fast setting. Now the slow setting is great if you do a lot of mixed media work with your crafts. It allows you to dry, paint in various different medias without warping or blowing or distorting that media too much. It then also has the second heat setting, which is the faster heat setting, and this is perfect for heat embossing because it heats up quickly, gets very hot, and that's what you need when you come to heat embossing, to melt the powder quickly and to reduce the warping to your card. Now be careful though, when you use the heat gun, do not put your hands over the vents of the heat gun. It's really important that you hold your hand further on down the barrel of the heat gun and not over the vents. You don't want to block the air going in and out of the heat gun. So when you come to actually heat your embossing powder, it's really important that your heat gun is very hot prior to coming to the card. If you start heating the card up as soon as you turn the heat gun on, after a while your card is going to start warping quickly before you've even started to melt your powder. So heat your gun away from the card, allow it to warm up for 15 to 20 seconds, then bring it to the card to start melting the powder. Now you can melt your powder from behind, and this can sometimes give you a little bit more control. You won't blow your powder off, and that's really useful when you come to heat embossing glitters, because you want the powder to melt before the glitter has a chance to blow off. Now I'm going to show you once more some heat embossing, but this time onto white cardstock with a different coloured embossing powder, just to show you how you can get really crisp embossing quite easily. So I'm using the same stamp and same sentiment again. I've treated my cardstock with that embossing powder to ensure that if I had any inky fingerprints on the card that I can't see, I know that the card has been treated and none of the powder is going to stick to any of my sticky fingerprints. It's only going to stick to where I stamp. So I've inked up my stamp using my embossing pad, and then I'm going to cover this one with Dixon Green embossing powder. I really love this embossing powder. I didn't think it'd be my kind of style, but it's such a really interesting powder. It's got some lovely greens, some teals, sort of some coppery browns, and then some metallic gold in there, and it's beautiful when it's heat set. So really, I recommend having this one in your stash. It is stunning. If you like the third degree embossing powder, I feel this is quite similar, or probably would complement it quite well. So again, as you can see, it's really easy to then funnel all that powder back into my pot using a coffee liner or a cake liner. Okay, so to heat set this, turned my gun on, I've put it on to heat setting 2, and I'm heating the gun up, allowing it to warm up away from the cardstock. As I start to heat the powder up, I move the gun around over the embossing powder and over the card. Don't keep it in the same position for the entire length, because that will start to warp your card and then also ruin your embossing powder, because it will overheat it, and when that happens it sinks into your card and you don't have that raised embossing effect. Now if you get a couple of little strays like I did, they were really minor strays of embossing powder on here, my tip to remove that is to just take a craft knife and just ever so slightly scrape away that embossing powder where the speck is. You don't really need to press down hard, and it's just ever so lightly to move it away. In addition, you could also use a mono sand eraser just to rub away where the embossing powder has been. And if that starts to peel a little bit of your card, you can just use a normal eraser just to rub over that, and it smooths it on down. But this then really adds a lovely crisp look to your embossing. It looks pristine and really, really professional. So those are my tips for getting great heat embossing. Whether it's using a solid stamp or a sentiment stamp like this, it's really easy if you just follow those simple steps to ensure that you get great embossing every time. I hope you enjoyed today's video and picked up some tips, especially if this is new to you and you're just starting out. Even if you're a long-time embosser, I hope this has just given you a bit of a refresher so you can hone your skills even more. Don't forget to hop over to the Facebook group where we have our monthly challenge, which is in DIY embellishments this month, where you could win a £15 or $15 gift card to Wow Embossing Powder. Also, why not think about giving this thumbs up? We'd love it if you could subscribe to the channel. If you want to check out my own personal channel, Pretty Little Button, I've included a link here as well as in the description box below. Until next time, happy crafting!